The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of courtroom 7B, casting long rectangles of light across the polished wooden floor. It was Tuesday, and Judge Amara Thomas was already on her third case of the day. At 45, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from 15 years on the bench. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her black robe hung perfectly pressed on her slender frame. "Next case," she called, her voice clear and measured. The courtroom settled as the bailiff announced, "The State versus Rodriguez. Possession of controlled substances." Judge Thomas nodded and glanced down at her docket. This was a routine preliminary hearing, nothing special. She looked up to see two new figures approaching the tables at the front of her courtroom. The defense attorney she recognized as public defender Helen Chen, but the officer who would be testifying was unfamiliar. Officer James Wilson strode into the courtroom like he owned it. 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and a buzz cut, he had been on the force for 12 years and had testified in court dozens of times. But as he walked past the gallery, something about his demeanor seemed different today. His back was a little too straight, his chin held a little too high. He didn't make eye contact with Judge Thomas as he took his place near the prosecutor's table. The prosecutor, a young man named David Reyes, stood up. "The state calls Officer James Wilson to the stand." Officer Wilson walked to the witness box, placing his hand on the Bible as the clerk swore him in. Judge Thomas noticed how he barely nodded at the clerk, a middle-aged black woman who had worked in this courthouse for over 20 years. "Officer Wilson," the prosecutor began, "can you please state your name and position for the record?" "James Wilson, patrol officer, 3rd Precinct." His voice was clipped, professional, but there was an undercurrent of something else that Judge Thomas couldn't quite place. "And were you on duty on the night of April 15th? Reyes continued. "Yes, I was patrolling the east side, near Parkview Heights." As Officer Wilson began to describe the routine traffic stop that had led to the discovery of drugs in the defendant's car, Judge Thomas observed his body language. He spoke confidently, as most experienced officers did, but she noticed he directed his answers almost exclusively to the male prosecutor, and rarely glanced in her direction, even when she was the one asking clarifying questions. "And officer, was the substance tested at the scene?" Judge Thomas asked, looking up from her notes. Officer Wilson shifted his weight. "Yeah," he paused, then added with what seemed like reluctance, "It was tested and came back positive for methamphetamine." Judge Thomas raised an eyebrow slightly at the casual "yeah," rather than the customary "yes, Your Honor," but she let it pass. Perhaps he was just nervous or having a bad day. The testimony continued and the pattern became more noticeable. Whenever Judge Thomas spoke, Officer Wilson's responses grew shorter. His shoulders tensed and he repeatedly called her ma'am instead of Your Honor. After the third time, the clerk gently intervened. "Officer Wilson, the proper address is Your Honor when speaking to Judge Thomas." Officer Wilson's jaw tightened. He gave a quick nod but said nothing in acknowledgement. Judge Thomas maintained her composure, face neutral as she continued to take notes. She had encountered this kind of behavior before, the subtle resistance, the barely concealed disrespect. After 15 years on the bench, she had developed a thick skin, but it never ceased to surprise her how some people still struggled with her authority. "Officer Wilson," she said, looking directly at him, "I'd like you to clarify the timeline of events. You said you pulled over the vehicle at 11:20 p.m., but your report indicates the stop occurred at 10:45 p.m. Can you explain the discrepancy?" For the first time, Officer Wilson seemed caught off guard. He shuffled through his papers, a flash of annoyance crossing his face. The report has a typo. It was definitely 11:20. The defense attorney perked up. "Your Honor, if I may, this is the first we're hearing of a typo in the official police report." Judge Thomas nodded. "Ms. Chen, you'll have your opportunity for cross-examination shortly." She turned back to Officer Wilson. "Officer, are there any other typos in your report that the court should be aware of?" Something flickered across Officer Wilson's face. Irritation, perhaps embarrassment. He glanced toward another uniformed officer sitting in the gallery, who gave him a small shrug. "No, Ma, Your Honor," he corrected himself, though the pause was noticeable. The prosecutor quickly jumped in to redirect the questioning, guiding Officer Wilson through the rest of his testimony. But the damage had been done. The defense attorney was now reviewing the police report with renewed interest, making notes for her cross-examination. During a brief pause while the prosecutor consulted his notes, Officer Wilson leaned back in the witness chair, his posture relaxed in a way that bordered on disrespectful. Judge Thomas caught him exchanging a look with his colleague in the gallery. Not quite an eye roll, but something close to it. The court reporter, a woman who had worked with Judge Thomas for years, glanced up with a concerned expression. She had seen this dynamic play out before, too. "Mr. Reyes, do you have further questions for this witness?" Judge Thomas asked, her tone professional. "Just one more line of questioning, Your Honor," the prosecutor replied. As the testimony continued, the tension in the courtroom grew. It wasn't just Judge Thomas who noticed Officer Wilson's attitude now. The gallery had picked up on it too. There were whispers, subtle shifts in posture as people leaned forward to watch the interaction. Officer Wilson's responses became increasingly clipped. When asked to read from his report, he spoke quickly, almost mumbling, as if rushing through an inconvenience. "Officer Wilson," Judge Thomas interrupted. "Please speak clearly for the record." He looked up, meeting her eyes directly for perhaps the first time. "Sorry," he said without adding the customary address. A small murmur ran through the courtroom. The prosecutor looked uncomfortable, shuffling his papers nervously. "Let's take a 5-minute recess," Judge Thomas announced, tapping her gavel lightly. "Court will resume at 10:45. As she stood to exit to her chambers, she overheard Officer Wilson mutter something to the prosecutor. She couldn't make out the exact words, but his tone was unmistakable, dismissive, almost mocking. In her chambers, Judge Thomas took a deep breath. She removed her reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. This wasn't the first time she had faced such behavior, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. When she had first been appointed to the bench, a colleague, an older, white judge who had become something of a mentor, had warned her that she would have to work twice as hard to command the same respect automatically given to others. "Some folks just aren't used to taking orders from someone who looks like you," he had told her bluntly. Judge Thomas had proven him right over the years, building a reputation as one of the fairest, most knowledgeable judges in the district. Attorneys respected her sharp legal mind, her thorough preparation, and her no-nonsense courtroom management. But occasionally, someone like Officer Wilson would come along, someone who couldn't quite hide their discomfort at her authority. Her clerk knocked softly before opening the door. "Judge, they're ready for you." Judge Thomas nodded, straightening her robe. "Thank you, Carol." As she walked back to the bench, Judge Thomas made a decision. She would not let Officer Wilson's behavior slide, but neither would she make a scene. There was a right way to handle this, a way that would address the disrespect without derailing the proceedings or making her appear emotional or reactive. The bailiff called the court to order as she took her seat. "All rise. Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Amara Thomas presiding." Officer Wilson was still in the witness box, his face now carefully composed. The defense attorney stood ready for cross-examination. The gallery had grown quieter, the atmosphere charged with anticipation. Judge Thomas looked out over her courtroom, her expression calm but resolute. She had worked too hard, overcome too many obstacles, to let anyone diminish her authority now. "Ms. Chen," she said to the defense attorney, "you may proceed with your cross-examination." As the questioning began, Judge Thomas watched Officer Wilson closely. His discomfort was growing more evident with each pointed question from the defense. The real test of his professionalism, and hers, was just beginning. Helen Chen stood up, smoothing her navy suit jacket as she approached the witness stand. A skilled public defender with 8 years of experience, she had a reputation for thorough cross-examinations. The tension in courtroom 7B was palpable as all eyes moved between her. "Officer Wilson and Judge Thomas." "Officer Wilson," Chen began, her voice calm but firm. "You testified that you pulled over Mr. Rodriguez's vehicle because of a broken taillight. Is that correct?" Wilson shifted in his seat. "That's right." Chen glanced at Judge Thomas, then back at Wilson. "Your Honor," she emphasized slightly, reminding him of protocol without directly calling him out. Wilson's jaw tightened. "Yes, that's correct," he said, still not adding the proper address. Judge Thomas made a small note on her legal pad but said nothing. "And according to your testimony, after you approached the vehicle, You noticed what appeared to be drug paraphernalia in plain sight on the passenger seat, which gave you probable cause to search the vehicle? That's what happened, Wilson replied, his tone growing defensive. Chen walked to the defense table and picked up a folder. I'd like to introduce Defense Exhibit A, Your Honor. These are photographs taken of the interior of my client's car immediately after his arrest. The bailiff took the photos and handed them to Judge Thomas, who examined them carefully before nodding. The exhibit may be introduced. Chen handed copies to the prosecutor and then showed them to Officer Wilson. Officer, can you point out where this drug paraphernalia was visible from outside the vehicle? Wilson studied the photos, frowning. It would have been right there, on the passenger seat. But there's nothing visible in these photos on the passenger seat, Chen pressed. It must have fallen to the floor during the arrest, Wilson said, his voice taking on an edge of irritation. Chen raised an eyebrow. Yet you didn't document that in your report, did you? I didn't think it was necessary to document every little detail, Wilson replied, a hint of condescension creeping into his voice. Officer Wilson, Judge Thomas interrupted, please remember that you're under oath. Every detail of an arrest that provides probable cause is indeed necessary to document. Wilson looked at Judge Thomas, and for a brief moment, something like contempt flashed across his face. With all due respect, ma'am, I've been doing this job for 12 years. I know what needs to be in a report. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor, David Reyes, winced visibly. Judge Thomas's expression remained neutral, but her eyes hardened. That's Your Honor, Officer Wilson, she corrected him, her voice level. And in my courtroom, proper documentation of probable cause is not optional. Please continue, Miss Chen. Chen nodded, sensing the shifting dynamics. Officer Wilson, in your report, you stated that Mr. Rodriguez was, and I quote, belligerent and uncooperative during the stop. Can you elaborate on what you meant by that? Wilson straightened his uniform tie. He kept questioning why I pulled him over. Wouldn't follow simple instructions? Typical attitude problem. Typical of what exactly? Chen asked, her tone innocent but her intention clear. Objection, Reyes called out. Counsel is leading the witness. I'm simply asking for clarification on the officer's own statement, Your Honor, Chen responded. Judge Thomas considered for a moment. Overruled. The witness may answer. Wilson glared at Chen. Typical of people who don't respect law enforcement. People who think they're above the law. I see, Chen said. And is there body camera footage of this interaction that might show this belligerence? Wilson's expression tightened. My camera malfunctioned that night. How convenient, Chen remarked. Objection. Reyes stood up. Sustained, Judge Thomas said. Ms. Chen, please refrain from editorial comments. Chen nodded respectfully. Of course, Your Honor. Officer Wilson, according to the log at the station, you didn't report this malfunction until 3 days after the arrest. Can you explain why? Wilson's face flushed slightly. I had more important things to deal with than paperwork. More important than preserving evidence? Chen pressed. Look, Wilson said, his frustration becoming more evident. I don't expect you to understand how things work on the street. We make split-second decisions. We don't have time to worry about crossing every T and dotting every I like you people do. The phrase you people hung in the air. Chen paused, letting the moment stretch. Judge Thomas leaned forward. Officer Wilson, what exactly do you mean by you people? Wilson glanced around the courtroom, suddenly aware of all the eyes on him. Lawyers. I meant lawyers, Your Honor. He added the title belatedly, almost as an afterthought. Judge Thomas held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. Continue, Ms. Chen. Chen walked back to the defense table and consulted her notes. Officer Wilson, this isn't the first time your body camera has conveniently malfunctioned during an arrest, is it? Objection, Reyes interrupted. Counsel is making accusations without foundation. Before Judge Thomas could rule, Wilson spoke up. I've had technical issues a few times. It happens to everyone on the force, Judge Thomas frowned. Officer Wilson, please wait for me to rule on objections before answering. She turned to Reyes. Mr. Reyes, does the prosecution have Officer Wilson's equipment maintenance records? Reyes shifted uncomfortably. Not at this time, Your Honor. Then I suggest you obtain them before we proceed further, Judge Thomas said firmly. Ms. Chen, do you have further questions for this witness? Just a few more, Your Honor, Chen replied. Officer Wilson, In your 12 years on the force, how many complaints have been filed against you for misconduct? Objection. Reyes was on his feet again. Irrelevant and prejudicial. Your Honor, Chen countered. I'm establishing a pattern of behavior that speaks directly to the officer's credibility as a witness. Judge Thomas considered both arguments. I'll allow it, but tread carefully, Ms. Chen. Officer Wilson, please answer the question. Wilson's face had grown increasingly red. I don't know the exact number. Would it refresh your memory if I told you it was 17 complaints? Chen asked. A low whistle came from somewhere in the gallery. Wilson's hands clenched into fists on his lap. Those complaints were all dismissed, he said through gritted teeth. Not all of them, Chen corrected. 3 resulted in official reprimands and 1 led to a 2-week suspension. Isn't that right? Wilson looked past Chen to his colleague in the gallery who was now staring at the floor. That suspension was political. They needed a scapegoat. Officer, Judge Thomas interjected. Please answer the question directly. Yes, Wilson finally admitted. I was suspended once, Chen nodded. No further questions for this witness, Your Honor. As Chen returned to her seat, Judge Thomas addressed the prosecutor. Mr. Reyes, do you wish to redirect? Reyes stood looking somewhat trapped. Just briefly, Your Honor. He approached Wilson, who was visibly seething. Officer Wilson, despite these issues raised by defense counsel, do you stand by your testimony that you had probable cause to search Mr. Rodriguez's vehicle? Absolutely, Wilson stated firmly. I saw what I saw. And the substances found in the vehicle did test positive for methamphetamine, correct? Yes, they did. No further questions, Your Honor, Reyes concluded, returning to his seat with obvious relief. Judge Thomas made a few notes, then looked up. Officer Wilson, you may step down. However, I expect you to remain available should the court need to recall you. Wilson stood, straightening his uniform. As he stepped down from the witness stand, he muttered something under his breath. Judge Thomas's head snapped up. Excuse me, officer? Did you have something to add for the record? The courtroom fell silent. Wilson hesitated, then shook his head. No, ma'am. Judge Thomas set down her pen deliberately. Officer Wilson approached the bench. Wilson reluctantly walked forward. Judge Thomas gestured for both attorneys to join them. The court reporter moved closer to capture the exchange. Officer Wilson, Judge Thomas said, her voice low but crystal clear. This is the 3rd time you have failed to address this court properly. I don't know if this is a habit of disrespect you show to all judges, or if there's something specific about my courtroom that you find difficult to respect. Wilson's face flushed. I meant no disrespect. Your actions suggest otherwise, Judge Thomas replied coolly. Now we're going to continue this hearing, and you're going to demonstrate the same professional courtesy that everyone else in this courtroom manages to show. Is that understood? Wilson nodded stiffly. Yes, Your Honor. Thank you, Judge Thomas said. You may return to the gallery. As Wilson walked back, Judge Thomas addressed both attorneys. Let's take a 15-minute recess before our next witness. Court is adjourned briefly. With a tap of her gavel, she stood and exited to her chambers. The moment the door closed behind her, the courtroom erupted in whispers. Carol, her clerk, followed her into the chambers with a concerned expression. Judge, do you want me to have a word with the bailiff about Officer Wilson? His behavior is completely out of line. Judge Thomas shook her head, removing her reading glasses. Not yet. Let's see how the rest of this plays out. Carol hesitated at the door. For what it's worth, the court reporter said she clearly heard what he muttered when leaving the stand. Judge Thomas looked up. And what was that exactly? She said he muttered, "This is why these positions should be earned, not given." Judge Thomas sat very still for a long moment. Then she put her glasses back on and picked up the case file. Thank you, Carol. Please let me know when everyone's ready to resume. Alone in her chambers, Judge Thomas took a deep breath. The comment stung, but it wasn't anything she hadn't heard before, just usually not so boldly in her own courtroom. She had worked too hard and accomplished too much to let someone like Officer Wilson shake her confidence, but this was quickly becoming more than a simple case of disrespect. It was challenging the very authority of her court, and that she could not allow to continue. She stood up, adjusted her robe, and prepared to return to the bench. Whatever happened next, she would face it with the same dignity and strength that had carried her through 15 years on the bench and a lifetime of similar challenges. The 15-minute Recess stretched to 20 as attorneys, and court staff whispered in clusters around the courtroom. Officer Wilson had joined his colleague in the back row, their heads bent close in conversation. The defendant, Mr. Rodriguez, sat quietly at the defense table, watching everything with wary eyes. When Judge Thomas finally returned to the bench, the room fell silent immediately. There was something different in her demeanor, a subtle shift that even those who didn't know her well could sense. Her face remained professionally neutral, but her posture was more deliberate, her movements precise. "Court is back in session," the bailiff announced. Judge Thomas looked down at her notes. "Mr. Reyes, please call your next witness." The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, the state calls Officer Lisa Patel." A female officer in uniform approached the stand. Unlike Wilson, she maintained proper courtroom etiquette, addressing Judge Thomas appropriately and answering questions clearly. She had been Wilson's backup on the night of the arrest and corroborated much of his account, though she admitted she hadn't seen the alleged drug paraphernalia until after the search was underway. Throughout Officer Patel's testimony, Wilson shifted restlessly in his seat. Twice, Judge Thomas caught him shaking his head slightly when certain details were discussed. His colleague beside him looked increasingly uncomfortable. When the defense began cross-examination of Officer Patel, Chen focused on the timeline. "Officer Patel, according to your report, you arrived approximately 3 minutes after Officer Wilson made the initial stop. Correct?" "Yes, that's right," Patel confirmed. "And by that time, Officer Wilson had already asked Mr. Rodriguez to step out of the vehicle?" "Yes, Your Honor," Patel replied, glancing briefly at Wilson. "And did Officer Wilson tell you what probable cause he had for the search before you arrived?" Patel hesitated. "He radioed that he had spotted contraband in plain view." "But when you arrived, did you personally see this contraband in plain view before the search began?" "No," Patel admitted. "By then, Officer Wilson was already conducting the search." Chen nodded. "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Thomas made a note, then looked at the prosecutor. "Mr. Reyes, do you have redirect?" "No, Your Honor," Reyes replied. "Very well. Officer Patel, you may step down." "Mr. Reyes, does the state have additional witnesses?" Reyes stood. "No, Your Honor, the state rests." Judge Thomas turned to the defense table. "Ms. Chen, are you prepared to present your case?" Before Chen could answer, a commotion from the gallery interrupted. Officer Wilson had leaned over to whisper something to his colleague, who was now trying to distance himself. The whisper had been just loud enough for those in the nearby rows to hear, and several people were turning to stare. Judge Thomas's gaze sharpened. "Is there a problem in my courtroom?" No one spoke. Wilson straightened in his seat, his expression defiant. "Officer Wilson," Judge Thomas said, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "Do you have something to share with this court?" Wilson hesitated, then stood. "No, Your Honor." Judge Thomas studied him for a long moment. "Are you certain? Because several people seem to have found your comments quite interesting." The tension in the room thickened. Wilson's colleague was now staring straight ahead, clearly wanting no part of whatever was unfolding. "I was just commenting on the case, Your Honor," Wilson finally said. "I see," Judge Thomas replied. "And do you typically comment on cases while they're still being heard? Is that standard procedure at your precinct?" Wilson's jaw tightened. "No, Your Honor. I didn't think so," Judge Thomas said. "Please remember that this is a court of law, not the precinct break room. Now let's continue." She turned back to the defense table. "Ms. Chen?" Chen rose. "Defense calls Mr. Luis Rodriguez to the stand." As the defendant was sworn in, Wilson shook his head again, more visibly this time. His colleague nudged him, a warning to stop, but Wilson ignored him. Rodriguez testified that he had been driving home from a late shift at the hospital where he worked as a janitor. He claimed he had no knowledge of any drugs in his car and suggested they might have belonged to a co-worker he had given a ride to earlier that day. "And did Officer Wilson tell you why he was searching your car?" Chen asked. "He just said he had probable cause," Rodriguez answered. "When I asked what that was, he told me to shut up and sit on the curb." Chen nodded. "What was Officer Wilson's demeanor toward you during this encounter?" "Objection," Reyes interrupted. "Calls for speculation." "Your Honor," Chen countered, "the defendant can certainly testify to how he was treated." "Overruled," Judge Thomas decided. "The witness may answer." Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. He was aggressive, like he'd already decided I was guilty before he even searched the car. When I tried to explain about my coworker, he laughed and said, "Sure, blame someone else. You people always do." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Thomas's pen paused on her notepad. "Mr. Rodriguez, are you certain that's what Officer Wilson said?" "Those exact words?" "Yes, Your Honor," Rodriguez replied. "I remember because it wasn't the first time I'd heard something like that from a cop." From the gallery came a sound, not quite a word, but clearly a scoff. All eyes turned to Officer Wilson, who was looking at the ceiling with a barely concealed smirk. Judge Thomas set down her pen. Officer Wilson approached the bench now. Wilson's smirk faltered. He rose slowly and walked forward. "Counsel, please join us," Judge Thomas added. Both attorneys approached. "Officer Wilson," Judge Thomas began, her voice low but intense, "this is my courtroom. In this room, I am the authority, not you. Your behavior today has been unprofessional, disrespectful, and borders on contempt of court. Do you understand the position you're putting yourself in?" Wilson's face flushed. "With all due respect, ma'am." "That's your honor," Judge Thomas cut him off. "And there is nothing respectful about your conduct today." "Your Honor," Wilson corrected himself, the words coming out stiffly. "I've been an officer for 12 years. I know how these cases go. These defendants will say anything to get off the hook. And judges with 15 years on the bench know how to evaluate testimony," Judge Thomas replied evenly. "That's my job, not yours." Wilson's nostrils flared. He glanced at the prosecutor, who was staring studiously at the floor, offering no support. "I understand you may be used to a different environment," Judge Thomas continued, "but in this courtroom we follow proper procedure. We show respect for the legal process. And most importantly, we treat everyone, defendants, witnesses, officers, and court officials, with professional courtesy." She paused. "Is that clear?" Wilson nodded curtly. "I need a verbal response for the record," Judge Thomas pressed. "Yes, Your Honor," Wilson managed. "Good. Now, I'm going to allow you to return to your seat. But if there is one more disruption from you, one more mutter, scoff, or inappropriate comment, I will hold you in contempt. Are we understood?" "Yes, Your Honor. You may step back." Wilson turned and walked back to his seat, his back rigid with anger. The attorneys returned to their tables. Judge Thomas addressed the court reporter. "Strike the bench conference from the record. Ms. Chen, please continue with your witness." Chen resumed questioning Rodriguez, who described the search and his arrest in detail. When she finished, Reyes conducted a brief cross-examination, focusing mainly on Rodriguez's relationship with the co-worker he claimed might have left the drugs. Throughout the testimony, Wilson sat silently, but his body language spoke volumes. His arms were crossed tightly, and his eyes never left Judge Thomas, watching her with a mixture of resentment and defiance. After Rodriguez stepped down, Chen announced, "The defense rests, Your Honor." Judge Thomas nodded. "We'll hear closing arguments then, Mr. Reyes." The prosecutor presented a straightforward case, emphasizing the discovery of drugs in the defendant's car and downplaying the inconsistencies in Officer Wilson's testimony. He avoided mentioning Wilson's behavior in the courtroom entirely. When it was Chen's turn, she focused on those very inconsistencies. "Your Honor, the state's case rests almost entirely on the testimony of Officer Wilson, testimony that is riddled with contradictions and unsupported claims. The alleged probable cause for the search, drug paraphernalia in plain sight, appears in no photographs and wasn't seen by the backup officer. The defendant has no prior record and a steady job. The evidence strongly suggests that Officer Wilson conducted an illegal search based on nothing more than a hunch, or worse, bias." As Chen concluded, Wilson shifted in his seat and muttered something to his colleague. This time, his words carried just far enough for several people in the gallery to hear clearly. This is why these positions should be earned, not given out like diversity prizes. The courtroom froze. The court reporter's hand stilled over her stenotype machine. The bailiff straightened, eyes widening. Even Wilson's colleague edged away from him, shock evident on his face. Judge Thomas had heard it too. Her expression didn't change, but something flashed in her eyes, not anger, but something colder and more focused. She set down her pen with deliberate care. "Officer Wilson," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, Please approach the bench one more time. Wilson hesitated, suddenly aware he had crossed a line from which there was no return. Now, officer, Judge Thomas repeated, as Wilson slowly rose to his feet. The tension in courtroom 7B reached its breaking point. Everyone present knew they were about to witness something they would be talking about for years to come. The moment when Judge Amara Thomas had finally had enough. Officer Wilson made his way to the bench with heavy steps. The entire courtroom had fallen into a silence so complete, you could hear the old clock on the wall ticking. Judge Thomas's face was composed, but her eyes never left Wilson as he approached. Both attorneys rose to join them, but Judge Thomas held up her hand. That won't be necessary, counsel. Please be seated. The attorneys exchanged glances before returning to their tables. This was unusual. Bench conferences typically included the lawyers. Whatever Judge Thomas planned to say, she wanted it to be between her and Officer Wilson only. When Wilson reached the bench, Judge Thomas leaned forward slightly. Though she kept her voice low, the courtroom was so quiet that her words carried to the first few rows. Officer Wilson, I'm going to ask you a simple question, and I expect an honest answer. Did you just suggest that my position as a judge was not earned but given to me as a diversity prize? Wilson's face flushed. For a moment he seemed to consider denying it, but the evidence was too clear. Too many people had heard him. I may have said something like that, he admitted grudgingly. Judge Thomas nodded once. I thought so. She straightened in her chair. Bailiff, please clear the courtroom. The bailiff looked surprised but immediately moved to action. All rise. This court is in temporary recess. Everyone except court staff, the defendant, and counsel will exit the courtroom. There was a shuffling of feet and murmurs of surprise as people gathered their belongings. Wilson's colleague from the police department hesitated, clearly torn between staying to support his fellow officer and escaping the brewing storm. In the end, he chose to leave with the others. Once the doors closed behind the last spectator, Judge Thomas addressed the remaining people. Court reporter, please continue recording. What I'm about to say needs to be on the record. She turned her attention back to Officer Wilson, who was standing rigidly at the bench, his eyes now fixed on a point somewhere over her left shoulder. Officer Wilson, Judge Thomas began, her voice no longer lowered. In my 15 years on this bench, I have dealt with all manner of difficult witnesses, combative attorneys, and yes, even disrespectful police officers. But rarely have I encountered the level of unprofessional behavior you have displayed in my courtroom today. Wilson's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. You have repeatedly failed to address this court properly. You have made inappropriate comments during testimony. You have openly mocked a defendant's statement. And now you have called into question the very legitimacy of my position as a judge. Judge Thomas folded her hands on the bench. Before I proceed further, I want to give you an opportunity to explain yourself. Why have you shown such contempt for these proceedings? Wilson shifted his weight. For a long moment it seemed he might refuse to answer. Then he spoke, his voice tight with restrained anger. I meant no disrespect to the court, Your Honor. Just to me personally, then? Judge Thomas asked, her eyebrow raised. Wilson's nostrils flared. I've been on the force for 12 years. I've testified in court hundreds of times. I know how these cases work. Drug dealers get caught, their lawyers find technicalities, and they walk. It's frustrating when what, Officer Wilson? Judge Thomas prompted when he stopped short. Wilson's eyes finally met hers. When good police work gets thrown out because of politics. Politics, Judge Thomas repeated. I see, and my position as a judge is political in your view. Not earned through merit. I didn't say that, Wilson backpedaled. You did, actually. Quite clearly. Judge Thomas leaned back in her chair. Officer Wilson, let me tell you a few things about how I earned my position. She removed her reading glasses and set them on the bench, her movements deliberate. I graduated at the top of my class from Harvard Law School. I spent 10 years as a prosecutor with a 94% conviction rate. I was appointed to this bench following a unanimous approval from a bipartisan judicial committee. And for 15 years I have maintained one of the lowest reversal rates in the circuit. She paused. Those are facts, Officer Wilson. Not politics, facts. Wilson's expression had changed slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Now, let me tell you what I know about you. Judge Thomas continued. Before today I knew only what was in your file. 12 years on the force. Generally good performance reviews. A few complaints, which is not unusual for an officer with your length of service. She put her glasses back on and glanced down at her notes. But today I've learned much more. I've learned that you are willing to cut corners in your police work, failing to document probable cause properly, neglecting to report equipment malfunctions in a timely manner. I've learned that you have a pattern of making assumptions about people based on factors other than evidence. And I've learned that when your authority is questioned, particularly by a woman of color, you resort to implying that she didn't earn her position. Wilson's face had gone from red to pale. The courtroom remained absolutely silent, the prosecutor and defense attorney watching with stunned expressions. "Your Honor, Wilson began. Judge Thomas held up her hand. "I'm not finished." She leaned forward again. "Let me be very clear about something, Officer Wilson. The respect due to this court isn't about me personally. It's about what this court represents, the rule of law. The same rule of law that gives your badge its authority. When you disrespect this court, you undermine the very system that gives meaning to your own position." She let those words sink in before continuing. "Now, I could hold you in contempt right now. I could have the bailiff take you into custody, fine you, perhaps even have you spend a night in a cell. That would be within my authority." She paused. "But I don't think that would accomplish what needs to happen here." Wilson looked confused. "Your Honor, what needs to happen, Officer Wilson, is for you to understand the damage your attitude does, not just to this court but to the entire justice system, including your role in it." Judge Thomas's voice remained even, but her words carried weight. When an officer of the law decides that certain rules don't apply to him, or that certain legal authorities aren't legitimate, that officer becomes a threat to justice, not a defender of it. Wilson's eyes dropped to the floor for the first time. "So here's what's going to happen," Judge Thomas continued. "I am going to issue a formal reprimand that will be sent to your commanding officer. I am going to recommend that you be required to attend additional training on courtroom procedure and professional conduct, and I am going to disregard your testimony in this case entirely, as I find it lacks credibility due to the numerous inconsistencies and your demonstrated bias." The prosecutor started to rise, likely to object, but Judge Thomas silenced him with a look. "Furthermore," she added, turning back to Wilson, "I am ordering you to issue a formal apology to this court before you leave today. Not to me personally, to the court as an institution." Wilson's hands clenched at his sides. For a moment it seemed he might refuse. The bailiff took a step closer, ready to intervene if necessary. But then something in Wilson's posture changed. His shoulders, which had been rigid with defiance, lowered slightly. The anger in his eyes gave way to something less certain, perhaps the first glimmer of reflection. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. And this time, the title came without hesitation or mockery. Judge Thomas studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You may return to your seat while I finish with this case. When I'm done, you'll deliver your apology and then you're free to go." As Wilson turned to walk back, Judge Thomas added, "And Officer Wilson, the next time you're in a courtroom, any courtroom, I suggest you remember that respect for the law isn't optional for those sworn to uphold it. It's essential." Wilson returned to his seat as Judge Thomas addressed the attorneys. "Bailiff, please bring the gallery back in." As people filed back into the courtroom, whispers spread like wildfire. Something had clearly happened, though few knew exactly what. Officer Wilson sat alone now, his colleague having chosen not to return. His posture was different, less defiant, more subdued. Judge Thomas waited until everyone was seated before speaking. "Having heard the evidence presented today, I am ready to rule on the defense motion to suppress the evidence obtained during the search of Mr. Rodriguez's vehicle." She looked at her notes one final time. "Based on the testimony presented, I find that Officer Wilson lacked sufficient probable cause for the search. His claim of drug paraphernalia in plain sight is not supported by photographic evidence or the testimony of his fellow officer. Furthermore, his own conduct in this courtroom has raised serious questions about his credibility as a witness." The prosecutor closed his eyes briefly, knowing what was coming. "Therefore," Judge Thomas continued, "I am granting the defense motion to suppress all evidence obtained during the search. Without that evidence, the state has no case. Mr. Rodriguez, you are free to go." She tapped her gavel once. "Before we adjourn, Officer Wilson has something he would like to say to the court." All eyes turned to Wilson as he slowly rose to his feet. His face was flushed with embarrassment, but when he spoke, his voice was clear and steady. I would like to apologize to the court for my unprofessional behavior today. I showed disrespect not only to Judge Thomas but to the judicial system itself. My conduct was unbecoming of a police officer, and I am sorry. Judge Thomas nodded once. Apology accepted, officer. Court is adjourned. As the room began to clear, Officer Wilson walked quickly toward the exit, but at the door he paused and looked back at Judge Thomas, who was gathering her papers. Their eyes met briefly across the courtroom, a moment of silent acknowledgement. Then he was gone. Judge Thomas remained at the bench until the room had emptied. Only then did she allow herself a small sigh, not of satisfaction or victory, but of weariness. This hadn't been about winning a power struggle. It had been about upholding something much more important, the dignity of justice itself. News of what had happened in courtroom 7B spread quickly through the courthouse, then the police department, and eventually across local legal circles. By the next morning, Judge Amara Thomas's measured response to Officer Wilson's disrespect had become the talk of the district. In her chambers the following day, Judge Thomas sorted through her docket as her clerk, Carol, brought in the morning coffee. You've become quite the celebrity overnight, Carol remarked, setting down a steaming mug on the desk. I've gotten 3 calls already from other judges wanting to know exactly what happened. Judge Thomas smiled slightly but didn't look up from her papers. And what did you tell them? That they should have been there to see it for themselves, Carol replied with a grin. Though I did mention how you never raised your voice once. That's what impressed everyone the most, I think. Judge Thomas finally looked up. Shouting has never been my style, Carol, you know that. I do, Carol nodded. 15 years, and I've never seen you lose your composure. Not even with that defense attorney who threw his briefcase at the wall. They shared a smile at the memory. Then Carol's expression grew more serious. The chief judge called earlier. He'd like to see you when you have a moment. Judge Thomas nodded, unsurprised. A formal reprimand of a police officer, especially one that included dismissing his testimony, was bound to attract attention from the court's leadership. She wasn't worried, though. She had acted within her authority and had the record to prove it. After finishing her morning calendar, Judge Thomas made her way to Chief Judge Robert Montgomery's chambers. At 72, Montgomery was the most senior judge in the district, respected for his fairness and institutional knowledge. Amara, he greeted her warmly, rising from behind his desk. Have a seat. I've been hearing quite a story about yesterday's proceedings in your courtroom. Judge Thomas sat across from him. I assume you've read my report? I have, Montgomery confirmed. Very thorough as always, but I wanted to hear your perspective directly. She recounted the events calmly, without embellishment. When she finished, Montgomery leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in front of him. The police commissioner called me this morning, he said after a moment. Judge Thomas waited, her expression neutral. He wasn't happy, Montgomery continued. Said you undermined one of his officers. I see. I told him I'd look into it, Montgomery said. Then a smile broke across his face. So I did. I reviewed the transcript, spoke with your court reporter, and even had a chat with the defense attorney. And do you know what I found? What's that? Judge Thomas asked. That you handled a difficult situation with exactly the kind of dignity and firmness this bench requires. Montgomery's smile faded. The commissioner wasn't pleased with my assessment, but he'll get over it. The fact is, you were right to call out that behavior. If anything, you showed remarkable restraint. Judge Thomas felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Though she stood by her actions, having the chief judge's support mattered. Thank you, Robert. Montgomery nodded. Now there is one other thing. The police academy director called as well. She's asked if you would consider speaking to their new class of recruits about courtroom procedure and professional conduct. Judge Thomas raised an eyebrow. Really? Apparently word of yesterday's events reached her too. She thinks it would be valuable for new officers to hear directly from a judge about the importance of courtroom conduct. Montgomery chuckled. I think she's trying to prevent future Officer Wilsons. Judge Thomas considered this. I'll think about it. Good, Montgomery said. Now go finish your calendar. And Amara, well done yesterday. As Judge Thomas left the chief judge's office, she felt a complex mix of emotions. The confrontation with Officer Wilson hadn't been pleasant. but perhaps some good might come of it after all. 3 days later, Judge Thomas was reviewing case files in her chambers when Carol knocked on her door. "Judge, there's someone here to see you." "Officer Wilson." Judge Thomas looked up in surprise. "Officer Wilson?" "Yes, he doesn't have an appointment, but he says it's important." Judge Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "Send him in." When Wilson entered her chambers, Judge Thomas noted immediately how different he appeared from the defiant officer who had stood in her courtroom. His uniform was impeccable, but his demeanor was subdued, almost humbled. "Your Honor," he said, remaining standing even after she gestured to a chair. "Thank you for seeing me. What can I do for you, Officer Wilson?" she asked, her tone professional but not cold. Wilson took a deep breath. "I wanted to apologize to you personally. What I said in your courtroom was disrespectful and wrong." Judge Thomas studied him for a moment. "I accepted your apology to the court already, officer." "I know," Wilson nodded. "But that was for the record. This is different." He finally sat down, perching on the edge of the chair. "After I left your courtroom, my captain called me into his office. He'd already heard what happened. News travels fast. He read me the riot act, then put me on desk duty for 2 weeks. Judge Thomas remained silent, letting him continue. "At first I was angry, felt like I was being punished unfairly." Wilson's eyes dropped to his hands. "But then something strange happened. My daughter asked me why I was home early, and I found myself unable to tell her the truth. I didn't want her to know what I'd said, how I'd acted." He looked up, meeting Judge Thomas's gaze. "That's when it hit me. If I was ashamed to tell my 8-year-old what I'd done, maybe I needed to take a hard look at myself." Judge Thomas nodded slightly, but still said nothing. "I've spent the last 3 days thinking about what you said, about undermining the system that gives meaning to my own position." Wilson shook his head. "You were right, and I was wrong. Not just about how I acted in court, but about other assumptions I've been making." He straightened in his chair. "I'm not here asking for anything, Your Honor. I just wanted you to know that what you said, it made an impact, and I'm going to do better." For the first time since he entered, Judge Thomas's expression softened slightly. "Thank you for telling me this, Officer Wilson. It can't have been easy to come here." "No, ma'am, I mean, Your Honor." Wilson corrected himself with a small, self-deprecating smile. "But it was necessary." As he stood to leave, Judge Thomas remembered her conversation with Montgomery. "Officer Wilson, the police academy has asked me to speak to new recruits about courtroom procedure. What do you think about that idea?" Wilson considered the question seriously. "I think it would be valuable, Your Honor, very valuable. Especially if you told them what you told me, about respect for the court being respect for the system itself." He hesitated, then added, "In fact, if it would help, I'd be willing to share my experience, as an example of what not to do." Judge Thomas raised her eyebrows, genuinely surprised by the offer. "That's a generous proposal, Officer Wilson." "Not generous," he shook his head. "Just right." After Wilson left, Judge Thomas sat quietly for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and called the police academy director. 6 weeks later, Judge Thomas stood before a class of 75 police academy recruits, their young faces attentive as she explained the importance of courtroom procedure and professional conduct. Beside her stood Officer Wilson, who had just finished sharing his story with remarkable honesty, describing not only what he had done wrong, but what he had learned from the experience. "The courtroom is where our justice system either succeeds or fails," Judge Thomas told the recruits, "and each of you will play a crucial role in that system. The respect you show, not just to judges but to defendants, witnesses, and the process itself, reflects your understanding of what justice truly means." She looked out at the diverse faces watching her, men and women of various backgrounds who would soon wear the badge. "The authority you'll carry as officers comes from the same source as the authority I carry as a judge, the law. When we respect each other's roles in upholding that law, the system works as it should." After the presentation, several recruits approached with questions. Judge Thomas noticed Officer Wilson speaking with a small group, his manner serious but engaging as he emphasized the importance of documentation and professional conduct. The academy director joined Judge Thomas, watching the scene with approval. "This has been incredible," she said. "I've never seen a class so engaged. Having both of you here, sharing different perspectives but the same message, it's powerful. Judge Thomas nodded. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from our most difficult moments. As they prepared to leave, Officer Wilson approached Judge Thomas one last time. Thank you for this opportunity, Your Honor. It means a lot to be able to turn what happened into something positive. You did that yourself, Officer Wilson, Judge Thomas replied. All I did was hold up a mirror. He nodded thoughtfully. Well, I needed to see that reflection, uncomfortable as it was. He extended his hand. I'm grateful. Judge Thomas shook his hand firmly. This wasn't about becoming friends or erasing what had happened. It was about something more important. Recognition of their shared commitment to justice. Despite their different roles and backgrounds, as she drove back to the courthouse, Judge Thomas reflected on the journey from that tense day in courtroom 7B to today. The easy path would have been simple punishment, holding Wilson in contempt, making an example of him through force. The harder path, the one she had chosen, required patience, dignity, and faith in people's capacity to grow. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. She knew that Wilson still had work to do on himself, as did many others in the system. Change didn't happen overnight. But seeing those young recruits today, hearing their thoughtful questions, and witnessing Wilson's genuine transformation gave her hope. In her 15 years on the bench, Judge Amara Thomas had learned that true authority didn't come from intimidation or volume. It came from something much more powerful, the quiet strength of dignity, knowledge, and unwavering principle. That was the lesson she hoped those recruits would carry with them long after they left the academy, and it was the legacy she continued to build, one case at a time in courtroom 7B.